Hi, welcome back to another edition of MD, PhD, ETC. I'm your host, Dr. Captain Dr. Robert McClay, MD, PhD, ETC. And today we're going to continue along the series about the magic of the masculine mind. Specifically in this segment, we're going to talk about the evolution of maleness and how that came to be through biological forces throughout history and, well, really throughout way before history and evolution. As a quick reminder, I'm somebody who grew up more as a nerd, as you can probably guess by the various titles, but after years of being a military psychiatrist, came to really appreciate the advantages of masculine thinking, sometimes not even in men and women as well, but how that could be adaptive. So I wanted to talk about how that was adaptive throughout evolution and how that probably came to be. A lot of guesses here in that regard, in regards to very ancient history. But there are some things we're fairly certain of. And one of those is that males didn't always exist. In fact, they didn't even come first. In the stories of Adam or Eve or a lot of creation myths, it's man created before women. But in reality, what paleontology and geology tell us is that males did not exist for the first few billion years of life on Earth. That the very first creatures weren't really female either. They were more what you consider asexual. They reproduced independently. The magic of the DNA molecule is it allows almost identical copies to be made of itself and then the structures which it directs. So one cell would simply divide into two, and the only way that change came about is if there was accidentally a ding to the DNA that caused a mutation. But otherwise just copies upon copies upon copies of things were made. And these were the early forms of life, what are called prokaryotes, very small cells that consists these days of bacteria and blue-green algae. Now, this all changed somewhere, and again, this is where it gets vague, between about 1.2 and 2.5 billion years ago. And this was the rise of what is called the Proterozoic era, named after protozoa, which are also single-celled organisms, but they're much larger and more complex than the earlier bacteria and blue-green algae that make up prokaryotic cells. These larger cells, these eukaryotic cells, also had the ability to form together into organs and then into organisms. So as opposed to the older cells, which only really maybe clustered together but never functioned as organisms, eukaryotic cells eventually formed into all the larger organisms, plants, animals, fungi, protozoa, and us. And there were a number of innovations that came along with this, clustering together to begin with, thicker walls of the cells, incorporating older cells in terms of their energy mechanisms. But one of the most important innovations was the invention of sex. And at this point, when we're talking about the invention of sex, we're not talking about anything vaguely, inappropriate here. How this sort of scene is always what gets clipped into the front title, isn't it, of talks. But that's not what this is about. No, what we're talking about here is the evolution of the ability to combine DNA from different organisms, of sexual reproduction. And that occurred with single-cell organisms to begin with. Now, combining DNA, the evolution of sex might seem inevitable. If you've done any sort of biology class, even in high school, you probably learned why there were advantages to this, that it allowed for faster evolution. But if cells had gotten along perfectly well, just dividing and cloning one after the other for billions of years, what was the pressure? Well, it was a time of great turmoil in this period. What had happened is these single-celled organisms, the very primitive cells, particularly the blue-green algae, were taking energy from the sun, and they were producing a waste gas over eons that turned out to be quite toxic. And that waste gas was oxygen. Now, we might all breathe a collective sigh of relief, full of oxygen, that is out there now, because that allows us more complicated organisms to exist these days because you can get so much energy out of it. But the problem was, to begin with, this energy was explosive. Oxygen is an incredibly dangerous gas when you look at it in the scale of most things. All fires that exist on Earth, for the most part, are oxygen reacting with something else. Explosions, likewise. It creates a process of oxidation, which is that oxygen tends to react with all kinds of things and often in destructive ways. So the creation of rust, degeneration, all of these things were caused by this toxic gas. So all of a sudden, organisms were under tremendous pressure to figure out how to adapt to this new toxic substance. Now, one of those adaptations was the fact that they took in older cells into the larger ones that had mastered the way of actually using the oxygen to produce energy. Those subunits or small cells that got incorporated into the larger, older ones were called mitochondria, and that'll come up as important later. But for right now, the key thing to think about is just that, again, a sexless world all of a sudden was filled with this new innovation of being able to combine. Now, that came with actually a number of disadvantages too. Sexual reproduction is just not as efficient in the grand scheme of things as asexual division. If you think about just the simple mathematics, if you start with 2 cells, each of which can divide into 2 cells, that the next generation is 4. But in order for sexual reproduction to occur, you actually have 2 cells that are required to meet, which takes a certain amount of energy for them to get together to begin with, but also then they are producing just one line of offspring. Admittedly, potentially multiples, but that could also have been said in terms of division. Why couldn't the one just divide into multiple ones? So bottom line is, even to this day, if you observe the speed at which asexual reproduction occurs, a bacteria dividing, versus the speed at which sexual reproduction occurs to amoeba conjugating, the asexual reproduction is always going to win out. But it doesn't adapt as quickly. So again, all of a sudden they're having to adapt to a rapidly changing world when oxygen is doing damage to the DNA. That is inducing some of the changes necessary, but sexual reproduction allows you to have 2 choices for every single gene as to which one might work. You get one from the one side of the family, one from the other. Not necessarily male and female yet. We're going to talk about that in a second. But you do get 2 choices for every gene with sexual reproduction, as opposed to with asexual reproduction, you just have to wait for an individual gene to happen to get hit by a free oxygen radical or a piece of radiation or something else that's going to change it. And then, hopefully that mutation is positive, but change is just not going to happen as quickly, and there isn't going to be a backup plan the way there is with sexual reproduction. So, yay for sex. As a quick aside, you can still see the difference here in experimental studies. If you take an organism that actually has the option of reproducing sexually or asexually, and there are organisms that can do either ways, and you put them in sort of calm, stable, well-fed, comfortable temperature environments, generally asexual reproduction will predominate. But if you then are a mean scientist and you tweak the environment, maybe limit the food supply to those singular cell organisms or raise or lower the temperature, then sexual reproduction will take over, and that'll become the prominent means by which the creatures reproduce. So you can clearly see the advantages and disadvantages, but again, we're going back to a time of high pressure where sex is necessary. So sex is useful in a harsh world, and eventually most organisms, especially larger organisms, come to use it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to acknowledge that male and female are useful. There are many creatures that are hermaphroditic, that contain the male and female aspects, and basically any 2 organisms can mix and create a new one. Vice versa, there are species in which there are gazillions of sexes. Mushrooms, in particular, are thought to sometimes have thousands of different sexes, different ways that combine and create new creatures. So why did the 2 pattern system, what's called a dioecious or 2 family system, in which they're male and female, end up being predominantly what you see in most higher organisms these days, in almost all animals, but also in a lot of plants? What was the advantage of this 2-sided system of actually creating males? Well, our best guess is it has something to do with those mitochondria that I was talking about earlier. So in general, eukaryotes developed this awesome system of sex where two cells combined and created a new one, and there was an equal opportunity from both sides. If one of the parents had a better surviving gene, then the line could adapt. Except not all reproduction within the cell is actually sexual or based on the same thing, because these eukaryotic cells had taken a shortcut in adapting to oxygen, which is they had incorporated the older cells, which became mitochondria, within themselves as their energy producers. And that was a good deal for them for the most part. But the fact is that mitochondria reproduce their own DNA, entirely independent of the rest of the process. Now, you still could combine. You get mitochondria from one parent, one mitochondria from the other parent. That might seem like an advantage, except the evolutionary force that is on the mitochondria is not necessarily the same evolutionary force that is present for the larger cell. So, for example, if you had a mitochondria that created a way to reproduce much more quickly, but is actually lower producing in terms of energy, that type of mitochondria might evolve better to survive within the larger cells. But in the meantime, overall, the cell is now wasting energy, producing more of these things for less energy overall. So over time, the species weakens because you can't really purge the mitochondria in the same way. There's not sort of an all or nothing. It just weakens things over time. So, but the difference when you develop male and female is actually that there are two different distinct types of sexual reproductive cells. And by the way, this is how scientists define sexual reproductive activity. We might think, oh, well, females are the ones that get pregnant. Nope. Male seahorses get pregnant. And we don't define it that way based on pregnancy. We base it on the size of the cells, is how we define what is male and female. Females make large reproductive cells. What in humans are called eggs or ova, and males create small reproductive cells. What in humans are called sperm. And part of the reason that those male cells are smaller is that they dump a lot of the extraneous material, including the cytoplasm, the area where basically everything except the DNA is stored. And they have just enough energy to get by for their reproductive purposes, really cut down to the, well, not bone because they don't have bones, but you get the idea. Sperm are minimalists. And one of the things that they do is shed their mitochondria. So unlike the mixing of the DNA from other things, you only get mitochondrial DNA from the maternal side. And what this means is that basically that you are now dependent on something that is either sort of an all or nothing decision. If the mitochondria work, then your cell does well. But if it doesn't, then that just dies off and that line dies off. So it's a way of sort of purging parasitic DNA in that way, which is why we don't get general weakening in mitochondrial diseases in humans. For the most part, those are lethal mutations. Now, if you're going to have two different types of cells, you've got to have a way to make those two different types of sexual cells. So there had to be a DNA driver behind this. And in higher organisms, in humans in particular, if you saw the earlier lecture, you'll know that this is the sex-determining region that is located on the Y chromosome. It allows the organisms to differentiate. But going along with that, it allows it to do more than just create sex cells that are different. And there is now an evolutionary pressure that goes with that, that says that males and females can evolve not just different individuals, but different forms in terms of being male and female, that there's going to be different DNA that directs how to make a male versus different DNA that directs how to make a female. Now, that's a small amount in terms of the overall bulk of DNA, but it does allow for dimorphism or variations within the same species so that males and females can end up looking quite different. Now, this isn't always the case. There are some species in which they're identical. As a matter of fact, for the example of eels, you can't even find their reproductive organs in most dissections. For this reason, Aristotle used this as one of the arguments why he thought spontaneous generation happened, because as far as he could tell from dissecting eels, they didn't have sex organs. They really do, but it's interesting they weren't discovered until just within the last few years, really. but those are very, very subtle differences. For other species, say the anglerfish, deep sea fish, the female looks pretty much like a fish. Really ugly, perhaps scary fish, but it looks like a fish. The male is a tiny fraction of the size of the female and looks more like a worm that sort of attaches itself to the female than it does what we would think of as a fish. A huge amount of dimorphism, to the extent that to some extent scientists classify the males as more of sort of a parasitic sexual organ than really its own distinct individuals. Women, you can choose to read into that whatever you would like about in terms of males in general. As an aside, this isn't actually the only way by which males and females can develop. If we look at some species, say reptiles, or particular species of reptiles, that a fertilized egg can actually end up being male or female depending on the temperature at which the egg is incubated. So identical genetics but different sexual outcomes. In other species such as frogs, they can actually switch in some case, and the overall environment can influence and change a tadpole from one gender to another. Or I should say one sex. I know gender is a tricky word here, but we're talking basic biology, so I hope no one's offended when I talk about this, that I am just talking about the genetic determinant or the physical form. When I'm talking about gender in animals, we'll talk about it differently when we get to humans. So back to sexual dimorphism and what is the effect of this genetic driving to create different forms, to create different sex cells, and the fact that in general, male ones are smaller, that they take less energy to produce them, and generally therefore males can produce a lot more of these than females who produce these larger, more complicated sexual cells. Well, in general, to begin with, it creates a weird pattern of competition where, because there are two different lines here, and you have to reach a mate of the opposite one, is there's now amongst your species not just competition with other things that are trying to eat you or that you're trying to eat or the environment in general. There is now competition within the species, within a gender, that if I'm male, I want to defeat all the other males to be able to get the females and reproduce, and vice versa for the females. We often think about that as perhaps selecting the best male. But why is that? Why is there a pressure on males to get perhaps more and for female animals to focus on getting the best? And that's largely because of the amount of energy that is put into the cell. Basically, that males can produce a lot of these and therefore could theoretically fertilize a lot of females, whereas females they have to put a lot more energy into the egg and therefore can accept fewer mates, no matter how wonderful they are at attracting them. Now, this doesn't show up in all species, by the way, that in some species that the females produce a lot of eggs, so therefore they do seek a large number of mates. But as we get closer to humans, that is the pattern that generally appears in mammals. So there's a certain pressure on males to be more competitive, to be more aggressive, and to adapt what are styles that would allow you to attract more mates. So there are two general ways, as broad categories, that you could become more successful in the animal kingdom. One of them we'll call the productive model, and the other the destructive model. Now, the productive model I'm going to talk about second because it is more complicated. It involves, to some extent, the idea of choice. And if we look at what is supposed to be a mechanistic universe, we can't really think about choice. We have to think about just reproductive advantage, which makes it a little bit more complicated. So we'll talk about the destructive model first, which is pretty straightforward, which if I'm a male trying to get as many females as possible, one of the simplest ways to do this is to get rid of all the other males, is to compete with them physically, or sometimes even to get rid of the male's offspring. So if you look at something like a Darwin's beetle, since we're talking about evolution, Darwin's beetle seems like a good example. They develop huge claws for the purpose of throwing their mates, throwing their components, keeping their mates, but throwing their opponents out of a tree so that they can't be competitors. Males also develop more aggressive behaviors as a whole. If we see in lions, they also develop bigger claws, obviously, for fighting. But, both males and females in lions tend to be very capable killers, hunters, very muscular, that sort of thing. These are predator animals. But what are the adaptations there other than large claws? Well, lions, for the most part, whether you're male or female, need to be fast and strong and have strong teeth to be able to catch an antelope, but nothing's really going to take a bite at their neck other than another lion. So male lions develop this huge mane to prevent another male from being able to tear their throat out, whereas females don't need that particular advantage. So if the destructive pathway was all there was to evolution, then probably men would in fact be the brutal, just awful creatures that sometimes we are made out to be, that the only way to gain an advantage would be to be hyper-aggressive, huge, muscle-bound, sharp teeth, long claws. But there is this other pathway which has created all kinds of interesting variations, which is the productive pathway. Now, the productive pathway means basically that you become more attractive to your spouse or allow your offspring to survive better. And this isn't entirely involving independently of the destructive pathway. A bull that evolved larger horns to fight rival bulls is also likely more adept at driving off predators that could kill his calves. Other characteristics that enhance survival of offspring, such as food gathering or nest building, do not generally face an evolutionary pressure to arise in one gender specifically, but sometimes may do so by random chance. So you do see in male birds, males tend to do most of the hunting while females sit in the nest. But if you flip that around lions, the females do most of the hunting. And even within birds, there are species that are quite egalitarian, like penguins, in which both will incubate and hunt at different times. But variations in these skills, if they are settled into the opposite sex or gender, mean that there are advantages of picking one mate over another. Choice becomes a powerful force in evolution. In some species, such as spotted hyenas, it is the males who do most of the choosing, but more commonly it's the females. And again, the most common explanation for why the choice is vested in the females is that they have fewer reproductive cells available, or generally picking only one mate at a time, etc. Most of you are probably familiar with that argument that a male may fertilize many females. For females, they may not have as many options. No topic is probably more popular among evolutionary armchair biologists. And the evolutionary pressures here seem obvious in certain animals such as elephant seals, in which males will maintain a harem of 40 to 50 females. These are the species that, like humans, tend to evolve males that are larger and more prone to combat. The more interesting question arises then, why do other male characteristics, including monogamy, sometimes evolve? Well, choice of mate has led to some spectacular, sometimes seemingly counterintuitive examples of sexual dimorphism. It's easy to see why a female eagle would evolve to select a male who can fly highest, why sexual drives might match to that, because if your sexual drive happened to be towards a larger male eagle, that your children end up being larger and they survive. So the choice is actually driven by the evolution, not the other way around. So the case of the eagle seems obvious. But why would a peahen pick a peacock with such large and seemingly predator-attracting colors? You would think that that would mean the offspring are also likely to show up on the predator's radar and be easier to be eaten. Yet this strategy of picking, quote, attractive males is not uncommon in nature. Animals as varied as the firefly and the frog select mating partners via characteristics that tread the... So as I mentioned earlier, one cannot simply in nature say that the evolutionary pressure was driven by it's pretty, because the idea of pretty or attractive should be shaped by evolution itself. So why would a female find something attractive that lowers survivability? And to some extent, this is the idea of strength through weakness, which is the obvious example of this in nature is bright colors. Eons ago, some small animal was born with bright orange colors. Most of these animals were easy to spot and fell immediately to predators. The exception were those that could fiercely defend themselves, often through poison. If you ate the orange animal, you died. An example of this is the monarch butterfly. Bright colors in nature thus became associated with fierce defense. Being able to show your weakness meant that you actually had to have strength underneath them. And even when the, say, poison faded, the female preference that was linked to this idea that the orange one was the ones that was poisonous, was more fierce, that's who you wanted to mate with, that the preference there could linger even if the actual survival trait disappeared. Now, all of this depends on the idea that females actually get a choice, that if you have a perfectly productive destructive mechanism, you're just driving off all the other males, the females don't really get to pick the pretty one. Probably explains why elephant seals are not the most attractive of males. But getting back to what we care about, which is humans. Again, are we brutes that are driven mostly by the idea of the destructive pathway? Well, there's some evidence that for humans, the productive pathway, the idea that female choice of mates, has been a huge driver in evolution. Obviously, not always the case. Rape occurred throughout history. Sometimes males such as Genghis Khan did wipe out large portions of his competition, and now accounts for some huge percentage of the overall genetics in Asian populations can be traced back to that one man killing off all of his competition. But if we look at the larger picture, and there are some clues that even in our primitive ancestors, before there were laws or respect for women or anything, female selection played an important part in how men evolved. Although human men never developed the bright decorations of other species in which selection seems to be the driving force, such as birds, we did evolve at least one evolutionary feature which is purely for the purpose of enhancing attractiveness to women. This is the human penis. Anyone looking at Greek or Roman statuary will notice that one thing seems off. The male genitals were very small. There are reasons to believe this might have been symbolic, as a large penis was sometimes associated with being bestial or crude. However, the ancients were generally very accurate in their portrayals of anatomy, so the obvious explanation is that selection caused evolution towards a larger penis size throughout history. That's debatable. Again, it might have been a matter of aesthetics and art. But if we look over longer time spans over evolution, the pressure in this direction seems obvious. Compared to other primates, humans have penises that are proportionally much larger than our simian cousins. We also are highly unusual among mammals in that the male genitals are continuously outside the body and come without a penis bone, that they display in a way in which there is large vascularization, blood flowing in there, makes them very prominent, noticeable. At least before the invention of clothing, this is something that probably was a means of display, but also, interestingly, would have made the males very vulnerable. So one of the main strategies in interprimate competition is to attack the genitals. This would have clearly been a liability in male-on-male violence, and actually even to other species. So, disputes among males are sometimes described as dick-measuring competitions, but there's no actual advantage of a larger genitalia in combat between males. Despite protestations about size not mattering, hundreds of thousands of years of selection by females says otherwise. Interestingly, the presence of exaggerated sexual characteristics in females in the human species, again, breasts in humans are much larger in proportion to their bodies than, say, in other simian species. The wide hips that have sometimes been noted, and, for example, ancient figures of fertility have been shown to be attractive to males, implies that there was also selection by males for particular characteristics in females, which, if you think about entirely sort of the harem system, really wouldn't make any sense. In elephant seals, the male is simply under pressure to get as many females as possible, and there's no real pressure at all to be picky. But the fact that this seems to occur in both directions implies that there was an evolutionary pressure towards choice in both directions, and which may have been involved with what we realistically know to be the male reproductive pattern in humans, which is pseudo-monogamous. Now, in animals, we generally divide animals up into monogamous and non-monogamous. For example, monogamous, they mate for right or generally stick with one. And then in other animals, again, like the elephant seal, where you attempt to gain harems. But more often in the real world, the monogamous is not truly monogamous. Even in birds like penguins, which we think of being as very faithful, they may mate with one animal for a season, but there's a tendency to pair off for a while, split apart, and then maybe come back with another different mate. And sometimes to have had several mates, sometimes just one in general. The pattern with males is to be more likely to drift towards the harem system at times, at other times towards individual partners, but also for the females to drift back and forth between partners. And this pseudo-polygamous selection style may be actually the driving force behind what ends up creating masculinity in humans. Polygamy is the strategy of many of our mammalian cousins, but it's energetically costly. You have to constantly be involving in battle to hold a harem. And there's evidence from animals such as red deer that the dominant males actually age more quickly because they had to spend all this energy in fighting. And for females, there's obvious disadvantages, since a male can devote less of his life to protecting her offspring in particular. Also that they may come in and wipe out some of the offspring, such as the case with lions. And most importantly, in terms of evolution, if there is a male who has a hidden defect, despite being the strong one that was able to drive off all the other ones, if there's a hidden defect that may pass throughout the entire harem and through a large portion of the species, resulting in much more damage to the larger population. Even in species, by the way, in which the destructive male-dominated strategy remains prominent, there are still workarounds.
Even in animals or in societies in which large harems are maintained and fiercely defended, and normally you would think that the lower males would have little to no chance of reproductive success, and the females would have no chance of having a variety for the father of their offspring. There are workarounds, what is called kleptogeny. Klepto as in the same derivative as the word kleptomaniac, meaning steal.
The more colorful name for this is the sneaky effer strategy. It means that physically less powerful males will sometimes sneak into a harem to mate, often while the alphas are battling. Kleptogeny requires some degree of cooperation from the females, since even if they were powerless to resist the advances, presumably the female could call attention from the dominant males, and therefore the sneaky, less dominant one would then be subject to injury and other unpleasant things. In humans, this has been put forward as one of the reasons for the genes for nearsightedness persisting as long as it did. Presumably, men with poor vision were poor hunters and therefore left behind, which may have lowered their social status but offered certain reproductive advantages while all the other menfolk were away. Having multiple sexual partners over time is also the advantage of females. As mentioned, the hidden genetic defect is more likely to be avoided if you have other options out there, not putting all your eggs in one basket, in this case, literally, right? This creates a competitive drive in both males and females in which both sexes would prefer the partner to remain faithful, but which also there is a craving for sexual variety. The pressure may be greater in males because of the need to try to develop a harem is one of the strategies, but it's present in both genders. Male and female presence in humans likely reach some form of detente. Polygamy is still present in some societies, polyandry in very few, but more commonly we have developed into the pseudo-monogamous pattern that is now seen across the globe. Once this was established as the pattern, evolution further selected for other traits that support this survival and reproduction arrangement. To mention for a moment the evolutionary pressures that come with pure monogamy versus pure polygamous reproductive styles, monogamy actually tends to support greater differentiation among the sexes because there can be division of labor, that these two creatures are pair bonded, and therefore one of the animals can do a particular task, the other animal can do a different task. For example, in emperor penguins, the male may sit on the egg at a particular time, the female hunts, and then at other times it's reversed. In purely polygamous societies, such again the elephant seal, the one male cannot possibly support 50 females. So the females have to evolve independently to be able to hunt, protect themselves, do all these sort of things, with the male really only serving the purpose of fighting with other males and mating with as many females as possible. Now, in terms of humans, this pseudo-polygamous style supports characteristics in which there is a division of labor, in which a male can support the female and the offspring, in which there is a pressure to be more attractive, but also overlaps with the issue where, again, there is a desire to drive other males away, to be able to dominate and that sort of thing. Nurturing and feeding and defending the family unit are basically useful characteristics for evolution in a pseudo-monogamous species. And in the final role of defending, there is particular risk that comes up. So if you look again at the pressure on males versus females, given that females in general, once we get to higher primates, are more defensive of their few eggs, the defensive role tends to fall on the males. Why is this? Nature is inherently stingy, Scrooge of the universe. Larger mass and greater weaponry in developing in a species requires more resources, more food, more of everything, really. If every member of the species is to grow that big, then there's less chance that the species would survive during times of drought or famine or just be able to support its bulk. Certain creatures, such as ants, solve this by creating distinct warrior classes. More commonly, however, the work gets divided along lines that are already driven by genetics. If the males already have to be larger in order to compete with each other, then this violent tasks, of which they've already developed the larger muscle mass, the larger horns, the more sharp nails, whatever it is, are also useful for driving off other predators or seeking prey. So in humans, males have a slightly greater propensity for polygamy, also have a slightly greater tendency to take on the warrior characteristics. Men are under evolutionary pressure to adapt to high-risk strategies, and in the end, are also more expendable. So this issue of expendability ends up being really interesting in both societal and evolutionary development in terms of males. The science fiction author Orson Scott Card did the Ender's Games book, perhaps not the most progressive source, but was the first one to introduce the idea to my thinking, pointed out that in general, males are viewed as either incredibly the most important person in the room of the society, the king, but then at the lower levels, they were quite willing to throw them away. If you're not serving a purpose, then the males has no intrinsic value. Whereas a female, in general, within primate and human societies, always at least serves that reproductive purpose. So there is less of a desire to allow them to die. And therefore there's more of a evolutionary pressure on women to, say, live longer, which in fact is what we turn up with. Vice versa, to allow males to go to war. And that might be one of the driving pressures behind this and behind certain male behaviors, the idea that we are essentially expendable and that we have to earn our keep in order to continue surviving, or at least to be able to reproduce, which for evolutionary point of view is the same thing. getting back to just genetics and evolution, what is the endpoint of all this separating and coming together of the sexes when it comes to the evolution of our current form? The genetic differences are pretty small, actually. There are somewhere between 20 and 25,000 genes in the human genome. Of those, only 55 are exclusive to males that are present on the Y chromosome. There are also somewhere between 900 and 14,000 genes on the X chromosome. Notice we don't understand that quite as well, but both men and women have those, actually. It's just that women have 2 copies and men only have 1. Those differences could still be powerful. Humans and chimps, for example, have only 1% of our DNA makeup is different, but we clearly have ended up more complicated than our simian cousins, and in our case, DNA is not the do-all, end-all of everything. Society and behaviors evolve right along with genetics. In fact, they do much faster than biology could change. The capacity to learn is perhaps the greatest epigenetic phenomenon in the history of evolution, the thing that can drive evolution apart from the actual DNA. Ideas and behaviors that perpetuate survival themselves are passed on, and those that do not perpetuate survival tend to go extinct. However, just as with the peacock's plumage, they can evolve in ways that aren't always suited to all environments, and it's highly conceivable that some of our gendered societal ideas have evolved in ways that are now counterintuitive and perhaps even counterproductive. But in a book that's about the masculine mind, or a lecture series about the masculine mind, the presumed goal is to eventually get to how male and female might have evolved differently in terms of their thinking and their minds. This in turn gives a sense of what could be changed, what forces might do so. The difficulty, however, is that along with our gender differences, we have clearly evolved a capacity for bias. The question of nature versus nurture is polluted by politics. Interestingly, the views of this have sort of switched around. Historically, it was liberals who contended that men and women's brains are identical in function. In recent years, that's been viewed as a more conservative and potentially politically biased argument. In particular, the area of transgender studies has highlighted the idea that some people may be born with a brain that does not match their body, and that this may have been determined at birth, that there are genetic determinants of sexual preference and other things like that. In the end, we can't avoid our own biases entirely, but we're going to do our best. I'm going to try. I hope that you will try. We want to look in the next segment at the issue of nature versus nurture. This evolution has created a creature in a certain form, which is us. We want to think about how society might have shaped our behaviors and our mind in particular ways that end up being masculine or feminine. We're going to look particularly also in a separate section on the views of people whose ideas might have been excluded for a long time, the transgendered, other individuals who have been excluded from the mainstream, and see what they teach us about gendered ideas and about society. But as always, we're going to use science as our tool. We're going to keep exploring and try to get back at this question of what creates masculine and feminine, what's good about it, what's bad about it. So in the next section, I encourage you to keep an open mind. I encourage you to hit me with areas in which maybe my own views were biased or wrong. Please leave comments and help shape that. And hopefully I'll see you back next time, where we will be talking specifically about nature versus nurture and how this creature that has evolved into humans has been shaped into certain views of gendered behavior. Thank you.